Let's get started. We have today's topic, sort of the twin with depression, today talking about schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, just like with the depression lecture, we start off with a semantic problem, and we start off with an additional problem as well. The semantic one, people often use the word schizophrenia in an everyday sense, or, wow, I had such a schizoid day. I got up and the car battery was dead and I was late at work, but then I got this great news at work, but then I had this argument with a friend at lunch, but then this terrific thing, and whoa, what a schizzy day. Schizoid, schizophrenic as just wild sort of fluctuations in mood and events, things of that sort. That is not schizophrenia. A handful of psychiatrists started pushing the hidden blessing school of thought in the late 60s, early 70s. And these were individuals who were credentialed, but nonetheless disastrous in what they were saying. And this kind of became in vogue in the 70s or so. I remember when I was in college, there was this movie called King of Hearts, and it's set in World War II, and this soldier wanders off from some horrible battle and finds in the woods there a mental asylum where the staff is all fled because of the fighting, and the asylum is being run by the mentally ill patients inside. And of course, they're far more humane and kind and wonderful than the people out there in a world of madness. These are the people who see things for really what they're like. Have schizophrenia, know someone who does, be a family member of, and what is abundantly agonizingly clear is there's no hidden blessings. It is a disaster of a disease for everyone who is touched by it. Now, as we start off looking at it, what we have is more than one disease. There's all sorts of subtypes of schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, a real doozy where you have combinations of both schizophrenia and depression, all sorts of subtypes. Yeah, it's not just one disease, it's a whole menagerie of them, and that is going to explain a lot about why this or that intervention only works on a subset of individuals, or this or that brain imaging finding is only found in a subset of individuals. It's heterogeneous. Okay, so we start off with our strategy. What does behavior look like? What does behavior look like broadly? The symptoms of schizophrenia are broken into two categories: things people with schizophrenia do that other people don't, things that other people do that people with schizophrenia don't. This is someone you meet and you start talking with them, and they're kind of making sense. 30 seconds into talking to them, you're having the feeling something is not quite right here. Now, the jumping around is part of what defines the disease as a cognitive disorder, a disorder of disordered thinking, tangenting, jumping around from topic to topic, sentence by sentence, with seemingly no connection other than similar word sounds, things of that sort. Someone with schizophrenia will meet someone and will say to them, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And the other person will say, "Well, actually, I'm a professional boxer." And the person with schizophrenia leaps back in horror and says, "Oh no, I'm allergic to dogs. I can't stay near you." Boxer, oh, I see. Boxer, one type of profession, one type of dog, just getting gummed up on the words overlap, similar words and such, and getting pulled into a completely different tangenting direction. Most of us, when recounting something, will go from A to B to C, etc., and somebody with schizophrenia will go from A to M to F to X, hopping all over the place. And a way to more broadly describe that is there's problems with the level of abstraction. Now, most of us are pretty good at being able to hear someone telling a story, and sensing, is this literal reportage of sequences of events? Is this like a little bit satirically exaggerated? Is this a parable? Is this a fable? And you have a pretty good intuitive sense of how literal you should be taking this. And what is seen in people with schizophrenia is trouble getting the right level of abstraction and consistently in the level of being overly concrete, getting gummed up on the sounds of words, things of that sort. So you will meet someone with schizophrenia, you'll say, "Hi, how are you today? What's on your mind?" And they'll say, "My hat." No, 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 on your mind. I don't literally mean on your mind. Or you'll say, "Hi, could I take your picture?" And they'll say, "I don't have a picture to give you." Not able to do anything other than take it on the most concrete level. What you see are delusions. Delusions, thoughts, beliefs that simply are not true. And like the big three on the list, it's always Jesus or Satan or whoever is or was the leader of their proud nation. And in different cultures, it's an equivalent playing out there, structured enough that there are most common hallucinations that occur. For reasons nobody fully understands, 90% of hallucinations in schizophrenia are auditory. You're hearing voices. You are not seeing the face of your grandmother on the body of a goat floating above your bed or something like that. Overwhelmingly auditory. And there's not a good explanation for that on a level that doesn't just say, "Oh, and the auditory cortex activates at that time." Now, this whole business about auditory, you are hallucinating communication. You are hallucinating spoken sounds. You are not hallucinating the sounds of a distant thunder. You are hearing communication. What's a great way of appreciating that? People with schizophrenia who are deaf have hallucinations in American Sign Language. They report disembodied hands signing to them. They report God signing to them, things of that sort. It's about the content, the communication. So the hallucinations there. What else? What else goes on in there? One of the really subtle things is there's a sense of detachment from the body. What do I mean by this? At long last in this course, we finally need to come to the topic of tickle science. I know you've tried it. If you haven't, if you're in the privacy of your own room, right now, try to tickle yourself. You can't tickle yourself. You can't. And scientists at one point got terribly interested in this and decided to study why people can't tickle themselves. And what they decided was it's because it's too predictable. You know you are about to do this with your finger at this time on this location, and to test that, they invented a tickle machine. This was like some sort of like stringy thing that had a fake finger on it and randomly putting in a bit of a delay. And it turns out, if you're surprised a little bit, I thought it was going to be here and it's there instead. And I thought it was going to be this instant and instead it was a little earlier, a little later. People perceive it as being ticklish. The reason why we don't find tickling ourselves to be ticklish is because there's no surprise about location or timing of it. So take someone with schizophrenia and they can tickle themselves. And what it's telling you is they don't have a very clear sense of what exactly is me here and what constitutes touching me at exactly the time I'm anticipating it. There's a detachment from the body. Two additional things going on the list here, and they are both very loaded. The first one is affective flattening. Emotions flatten out, a lack of expressiveness in faces, an apathy about events, a tendency to completely misinterpret somebody else's affective state. And they give these sort of tests where, like, you're listening to somebody describing something terrible, some horrendous event, and their tone of voice is completely wrong, their atrocity. They're saying something like, "And then they drown the puppies." And your normal person would say, "Whoa, there's something kind of discordant with that." People with schizophrenia don't notice it. Not only do they not express a whole lot in terms of emotions, they're pretty bad at reading it in other people. In addition, there is social withdrawal. And this speaks to an interesting thing. 2 days ago, we were covering depression, and what everyone knows is that depression is a disease of emotions, of affect. Well, no, also, as we saw, is a disease of distorted cognition. Schizophrenia, everybody knows it's a disease of distorted thought. It's also a disease of emotional abnormalities. And what you see with the withdrawal is people with schizophrenia are alone and isolated in culture after culture, and they are not sitting there lost in their hallucinations, feeling nothing. They feel alone. And everyone has that stereotype of the mentally ill person being violent. Far, far more likely is self-directed violence, mutilation, suicidality, and so on. High rates of people with schizophrenia intentionally injuring themselves, suicide. There's a certain likelihood of people with schizophrenia attempting suicide when they're in a psychotic episode, but when it's in the trough in between them, the likelihood is even higher then. In other words, if you were in a position where you could objectively see how maddened the rest of your life is when you're during one of those episodes, if that's the most likely time you want to choose to end your life, there's hidden blessings there. Now, the self-mutilation schizophrenia can take some very bizarre forms. And while I was in grad school at New York, there was this story going around the various med schools and grad schools and stuff. This was at Columbia Med School where there was a fourth-year student with a history of psychiatric instability, and frankly, it was kind of a miracle that he had gotten that far. And he had a psychotic break, and he had taken a leave from medical school. So he was at home, and among his delusions was a belief that his mind was being poisoned, his mind was being driven to satanic thoughts by testosterone. So, what did he do? He castrated himself to get rid of all of that testosterone. And being a well-trained endocrinologist, he knew something that all of you know by now, which is testosterone androgens also come out of the adrenal gland. And he attempted to adrenalectomize himself. Alcohol, and he got a little mirror that he angled so he could be looking in with one hand with a scalpel and trying to cut out his adrenals. And at one point, he nicked a blood vessel and he went into the emergency room where his old classmates are working there. And he did not go in and say, "Help me. Look what I'm doing to myself." I don't know why. He went in and said, "Hey, guys, I'm trying to take out my adrenals and I kind of need a hand here. Can you give me a hand? It's a little tricky." Okay, so this gives us a sense of the disease demographics. 1 to 2% of the population in every culture on Earth comes down with schizophrenia. There's no sex difference in it. There's no difference in what socioeconomic class succumbs to it. People with schizophrenia are very rarely very capable of being CEOs of companies or things like that. Regardless of what SES class you're born into, there's a tendency that you spiral down because you can't work or you're homeless or things of that sort. That's what you wind up seeing. The most important piece of demography about schizophrenia that we are going to look at in oh so much detail is this is a disease that is overwhelmingly likely to first appear in late adolescence, early adulthood. Basically, if you were 25 years old and you are not suffering from schizophrenia, the odds are very, very high that you never will. It's a late adolescence, early onset early adult onset psychiatric disorder, and you better be speculating about some plausible neurobiology right at this point. Okay, so that's what schizophrenia looks like. That's what the behavior is like. And if you think about it, there's a massive, massive problem with trying to think about what constitutes this disease. Because if you wanted to summarize all of this into a simple sentence, this is the disease of people who think differently from everyone else. And whoa, That is a loaded statement. And to give you a sense of it and sort of the exotic realms in which this could be appreciated, let me tell you, sort of over my years of field work with my baboons in East Africa, I was living in a national park that just across the boundary. The nearest people living there were Maasai. Maasai tribes people. Maasai are nomadic pastoralists. They have warrior classes. They've got all that stuff. They have clitorectomies. They've got circumcisions. They're polygamous. They, like an adolescent boy, when first becoming a warrior, he has to prove his worth by going out and killing a lion on his own or don't come back. That was done. Women wear the placenta that they gave of the child they gave birth to as a fertility marker for their next child. This is people who were living off of cow's blood, and cow's milk is 90% of the diet. This is a very different way of living your life. Let me tell you about the one person with schizophrenia, one Maasai, who I ever encountered. And this was many years ago, and I was sitting in my camp one day, and suddenly three women from the nearby village came running into camp. They had run like a mile from there, and they were all agitated. And Maasai do not get agitated. Maasai do not get panicked about things. Maasai are unflappable. These women were flapped. They were all agitated. They were saying, "Oh my God, you got to come to the village. This woman, she did this terrible thing, and oh my God." And it took me a while to realize what I was being useful for here is that I had a vehicle. So we jumped in the Jeep and drove down to the village. And on the way there, they were describing to me that there's this woman in the village who's just done something really, really wrong. And as they're describing her, I had been around a few years at this point and hung out sort of at this village, I don't know, an afternoon or so a week. And this is someone I had never encountered. This was somebody living in a hut in the back there who you never saw. So they're describing her, and she's done something really bad. She has killed a goat. Okay, so we get to the village, and I'm thinking that, okay, there's going to be this woman there, and it's interesting. We can talk to her and see is she like having loose associations and asking her in Ma, the language the Maasai speak, asking her, is she hearing voices? And this is going to be so fascinating. And I step out of my vehicle, and there is this huge naked woman with a dead goat in her mouth that comes barreling at me, knocks me over, and tries to strangle me. Okay, we all have our inner fantasy lives, but never once did this occur to me as something that would be remotely appealing. I'm there, she's choking me. I'm thinking, this is how I'm going to die. My parents have to tell everybody this is what happened. Fortunately, the rest of the women grab her and pull her off me, and she and the goat still in her mouth, and she's covered with goat intestines and goat feces and goat blood and all of that. They push her into the back of my Jeep and pile in on top of her and say, "Let's go. Let's go. Let's drive 50 miles to the nearest government health clinic," which is why they had like come for me in my vehicle in the first place. So we're driving there, and it's mostly without a road, and it's taken a while, and it's a couple of hours, and the whole time she is bellowing in the back, and they're holding her down, and she keeps trying to grab me from behind and pull me back there, and she keeps yelling a word at me which I didn't understand, but later was told that she was yelling that I was a demon, which in some totally weird way felt kind of cool and manly or something. But she's, and there's like goat shit all over the back and goat intestines, and it's hot in there, and it's crowded, and this stuff's starting to smell, and this is really not fun. Finally, we get to the government health clinic, which is a wooden hut where there's a government nurse, someone who received about 2 weeks of training at some point, such that you go to them with any complaint whatsoever, and they give you medication for malaria. That's what this clinic does. So we got out and we pulled her out, and like, what are we going to do now? And they pushed her into the hut. All the Maasai women pushed her in there, and they got some wood and they hammered it. They hammered the door shut with her inside. I said, whoa, Well, now what do we do? Does the nurse talk to her and try to figure out what's going on? Do we go back and get her relatives to come here and do that? What should we do now? Should we try to talk with her? And they say, hell no, let's get out of here. And thus we get a first lesson in this aspect of mental illness in a very different culture. They are no more comfortable and accepting of the mentally ill than we are. When it is a florid mental illness, they get the heebie-jeebies in this. It's different of a culture on Earth as our own. As we get here, yeah, let's get out of here. So they convinced me of that, and we pile into the Jeep and we start the 2 hour drive back and, roll down the windows and it's beginning to air out from the goat stuff and calm down. And it suddenly strikes me, what a marvelous, marvelous opportunity to do some cross-cultural psychiatry. So I turn to my friend, the woman who I know best, and I say to her, whoa, what do you suppose was wrong with that woman? And she looks at me like I'm an idiot. She says, she's mentally ill. She didn't say she's mentally ill. What she said literally was that she has a sickness in her head. I said, oh, that's interesting. She has a sickness in her head. So how do you know? How could you tell that she does? And again, she looks at me like I'm an idiot and she says, she killed a goat. And I say, oh, come on, you guys kill goats all the time. And she got exasperated at me. Women do not kill goats. Old men kill goats. Old men kill goats and have a ritualistic belief that it is very bad luck indeed to have women present when you were killing a goat. And what's that for? That's so you and your buddies can make a goat roast and eat it all yourselves and not share it with them. And you'd be sitting in camp and you see, like, in the afternoon, in the bushes, there are a whole bunch of these old guys tiptoeing through with a goat, and they're all giggling, and okay, they're off to have a men only goat roast sort of thing. That, yeah, women do not kill goats. Women do not kill goats with their bare hands and then run around naked with the goat in their mouth afterward. Okay, so then I say, well, how else do you know that she has an illness in her head? And she says, she hears voices. And I said, come on, you Maasai hear voices all the time. What's the big deal? Which they do. Maasai, at various points, they have to do a cattle drive. They walk their cattle 100 miles to sell them at some gathering or whatever. And even before everybody gets into this sort of trance dance state, because they are going to walk around the clock for the 100 miles, it's safer from predators. And they all get into the state, and all of the Maasai I've spoken to about it say, yeah, you kind of hear voices at that point. So I say to her, oh, come on, you guys hear voices. And she looked totally exasperated with me. And in one sentence, she summarized everything you need to know about cross cultural psychiatry. She said, yeah, but she hears voices at the wrong time. And suddenly we have this challenge of a disease where its definition is you think differently from everybody else. You think differently than you're supposed to. And that is a minefield because sometimes thinking differently represents a mental illness. Sometimes thinking differently represents great creativity and someone who's going to transform the world. Sometimes someone thinking differently is a political dissident, and dictatorship after dictatorship in the West has a history of imprisoning dissidents in psychiatric hospitals, accusing them of being mentally ill if they are unthrilled about dear leader being leader for life now, all of that. How do you possibly diagnose a disease where the rule is the person thinks differently from how they're supposed to think, from how everybody else thinks? And what we get is the first hint here with the story, which is you better understand what counts as normal thinking in that culture, because it may be really different from yours. And this is a very exotic version, but lots of you are going to be in med school down the line during psychiatry at some point. You're going to be in an emergency room and somebody comes in who is floridly in a psychotic crisis, and they're from a very different culture than the norm or what you know about, and you better figure out what counts as normal for them. Because if everybody hears voices on occasion, it is possible to hear voices, but at the wrong time. And that's the thing that is diagnostic. Okay, so this takes us out into the brain. What's going on in the brain of somebody with schizophrenia 1 second before they have the loose association, any of that? And what we turn to is our synapse yet again. And today's synapse is all about dopamine. And 50 years into it, the best evidence is schizophrenia involves an excess of dopamine. Which part of the brain? I don't know. We'll get to that. But it involves an excess of dopamine. What's the evidence for it? Something that completely transformed sort of the history of medicine and psychiatry, which was the development of drugs that would block dopamine receptors. Drugs that came to be called neuroleptics, antipsychotics, Haldol, Thorazine, any of that. And when you give this to somebody with schizophrenia, when you block their dopamine receptors, they suddenly become less psychotic. They suddenly have less severe symptoms when you block the dopamine receptors. And people mostly stumbled into this finding by accident. Anytime you're watching like some TV medical drama and there's someone having a psychotic break in the ER and everybody's trying to wrestle them down, and the first year med student is the one who grabs a syringe and pokes it into the guy's ass and injects them, and 2 minutes later they've calmed down. They have injected them with a dopamine receptor blocker. So we've got our same logic from the other day. If you block dopamine signaling and individuals suddenly start feeling better, what's your hypothesis? Schizophrenia is about an excess of dopamine. And more evidence for that in all sorts of other domains. You look in the blood, you look in the urine, you look in the cerebral spinal fluid of people with schizophrenia, and you get indications of excessive dopamine signaling. You look at the post-mortem brain of somebody with schizophrenia, and you will see evidence of abnormal levels of dopamine in some parts of the brain. More stuff, more evidence of it. Sometimes you can have a problem with schizophrenia where you are having an enzyme. We know the story already. Dopamine does this thing, comes floating off, and it is broken down by this enzyme and deactivated. And if this doesn't work, dopamine accumulates there, it gets more and more hitting, and you get the symptoms of schizophrenia, as we'll see mutations in this gene. Catechol methyltransferase mutations in that are one of the ones implicated in this disease. You also see the dopamine hypothesis being implicated in a really different way. Okay, hopefully what you sense by now, is the same neurotransmitter has very different functions in different parts of the brain, the same way that a letter can appear in all sorts of very different words. There's multiple uses in multiple locations. So we now consider the neurological disease of Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's, one of those diseases you do not want to get if you have a choice in the matter. What Parkinson's involves is too little dopamine. Too little dopamine in an area so far from the limbic system, dopamine having to do with fine motor control, so that if you have Parkinson's and you're losing dopamine in this part of the brain called the substantia nigra, and you're losing dopamine there because the dopamine neurons are dying, what you begin to get is a Parkinsonian tremor. And at full-blown Parkinson's, you get writhing, you have trouble initiating movements, all of that. So people were figuring this out back when in the 60s, and they had figured out the part of the brain and realized there's neurons dying there, and these are neurons that release dopamine. So that gave rise to the first treatment for Parkinson's disease. Let's give them dopamine to replace the missing dopamine. Turns out you can't give dopamine. You got to give an earlier version of it in the synthesis, something called L-DOPA. But let's give them dopamine to take care of their Parkinsonian tremors. Well, meanwhile, across town, these people who think that schizophrenia involves an excess of dopamine are using a drug to block dopamine receptors. So here's the critical thing. You take that antipsychotic drug Or you take that dopamine replacing drug and no one is drilling a hole in your brain and spritzing it in this one given spot. You're swallowing it, it's injected, it's getting all over the brain and blocking dopamine receptors all over the brain, including all the areas having nothing to do with schizophrenia, or boosting up dopamine in all the areas of the brain, most of which have nothing to do with Parkinson's. And what you wind up getting there is if your starting problem is, say, too elevated of dopamine levels in one part of the brain, block the dopamine system and everything else here is normal, block the dopamine system, and as a result, okay, let's draw it here. As a result, you bring that back down to normal, but what you also do is you cause a depletion of these other ones and flip it in the other direction with Parkinson's. So schizophrenia, too much dopamine, and you throw a drug into the entire brain that blocks dopamine signaling. I bet if you give somebody too much dopamine receptor blockers in schizophrenia, they'll start to look like someone with Parkinson's disease. And that's exactly the case. It's called tardive dyskinesia. Go into a state hospital and there's somebody sitting there in the back and they are tremoring like this nonstop. They've been taking these neuroleptic drugs, these dopamine receptor blockers for decades by then. Oh, because while you're bringing down dopamine to normal levels in the schizophrenia part of the brain, you're driving it to below normal in other areas, including the Parkinsonian area. And now you make the opposite prediction. Ooh, you give this person replacement dopamine to make up for the dopamine paucity. And if you give them too high of a dose, they should start looking like somebody with schizophrenia. And that's exactly one of the side effects of over medicating somebody. You get a psychosis. So this in and of itself is a wonderful internal control, saying too much dopamine in schizophrenia. So that's great. What are the consequences of that? Is this somebody who has too much anticipation? Is this someone who has too much pleasure? How does it fit into anything we know is doing something in the frontal cortex? You know that mesolimbic, mesocortical dopamine projections is doing something up there having to do with like logical thinking, all of that. Maybe in a little bit, we'll be seeing something much more interesting that may be involved in the dopamine there. Okay, so dopamine. Ask anybody who's obsessed with schizophrenia what neurotransmitter comes to mind, and the first one is dopamine. Serotonin is also involved, or at least people used to think it was, for a very simple reason. Here's the chemical structure of serotonin. Do not write this down, just note the outline shape of it and all of that. And this is a different molecule. This is LSD, or maybe it's psilocybin or mescaline. This is one of the major hallucinogens. All of the major hallucinogens fit into serotonin receptors because they look just like serotonin and fake the receptor into thinking that they've been communicated with by the neuron upstream when it's just this drug you've taken. Oh, throw in drugs that randomly stimulate serotonin pathways, and you get hallucinations. Maybe there's something up with that going on. Maybe that's what the hallucinate. Maybe we've got a problem in schizophrenia of too much serotonin on the scene. And people have been looking for evidence of that, or they've been looking for some endogenous hallucinogen that's made in the brains of people with schizophrenia that acts like LSD or something. And people were so excited about this in the past, and mostly it has not come through. And instead, we get a much more interesting piece of insight into what the hallucinations are about in schizophrenia, which takes us back to dopamine. Dopamine is schizophrenia, disease of too much anticipation. That just sounds weird, all of that. And that confusion reflects the fact that you assume that if there's an excess of dopamine in schizophrenia, it's because the levels are too high. Turns out when the techniques get fancy enough to look at, that's not what the dopamine excess is like in schizophrenia. What it is there's frequent spikes, a higher frequency of these spikes occurring. So what happens during these spikes? And this introduces now our broadest sense of what dopamine does: reward, but also anticipation and then goal-directed motivation, all of that. What ultimately dopamine is about is it signals salience. It signals this thing is significant. This potential reward has caught my attention. This potential punishment has caught my attention, which is why some parts of dopamine code for that. It is a signal of salience. This is important. Pay attention to it. So you've got someone with schizophrenia where rather than like the normal sort of tonic release of it, you're getting these crazy spikes. And that is so significant that that person just glances, that you delusionally believe this person is a spy monitoring you. And that internal voice you were thinking with at the time has to be a real voice, and you believe some delusion you come up with to try to explain what's going on. There's evidence that glutamate is involved as well. What's the evidence? There's a class of drugs that you can use to abuse and get hallucinations, and those involve glutamate receptor systems. These are angel dust, PCP, phencyclidine. Yeah, maybe. By the way, I darted and anesthetized my baboons with PCP, which was really interesting, trying to get through customs to take it out there. But angel dust, PCP, people hallucinate. Maybe there's something with glutamate in schizophrenia. Nah, when you look closely, and the hallucinations are very, very different from that. One last detail of the neurochemistry, which is there may be something wrong related to this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And I think we have not even thought about acetylcholine once in this class, or maybe once in passing. But acetylcholine, it's this neurotransmitter, and it works through two receptor types. One is called the muscarinic receptor, and the other is called the nicotinic receptor. And there's some evidence that there's something wrong with the nicotinic receptor in schizophrenia, so that it needs a particularly large oomph to activate it. Huh, what's that about? Where did the name come from? This is the receptor for nicotine. It is activated by nicotine, which can work like acetylcholine in that condition, and it explains a weird clinical feature of schizophrenia, which is like 90% of people with it are frantic chain smokers. And this may have something to do with you were dealing with a paucity of stimulating these nicotinic receptors. Okay, so that gives us a sense of the neurochemistry. What's going on metabolically in the brain? What parts of the brain are activated when, say, someone with schizophrenia is having a hallucination? This is really hard to study because you're sticking this person in a brain scanner and just crossing your fingers that they'll happen to have a hallucination at that point. And who knows when that occurs, and you're never going to graduate because you can't get enough study subjects who just happen to have a hallucination while they're inside the brain scanner. And inducing it with some other drug tells you nothing about schizophrenia. Nonetheless, some of those studies have been done, and what you see is like just all sorts of areas of the brain activate, and like nothing that makes a whole lot of sense to me, or reading people who actually work in this area, their attempts to interpret it make a whole lot of sense to them. The one interesting thing in it is consistently you're seeing activation of the auditory cortex, auditory hallucinations, and that tends to correspond with that. So the question then becomes, if you see these 5 areas in the brain are activated during hallucination, are these the 5 areas that cause a hallucination? Does the hallucination start in this area and it drives these into activity because of the hallucination? Is all of them activating, whichever one starts first, synonymous with the hallucination? Very, very tough interpretive stuff there. Brain structure. Are there structural differences in the brains of people with schizophrenia versus everyone else? And the answer is yes, once you deal with the fact that these are incredibly difficult studies to do. You got to get the brain from the person, and there's all sorts of like these rapid autopsy teams connected with research in these areas, research with Alzheimer's as well, trying to get a brain out quickly. And people began to see that there were some weird structural abnormalities in the brains of people post-mortem with schizophrenia. And immediately this raised a problem that maybe there was a post-mortem pressure abnormality in the process. What am I talking about? Maybe somebody accidentally squished the brain, taking it out of the skull there. And we will see a reason why people thought that maybe the brain was getting squished. Okay, so you got to be really careful how you take the brain out. But all of that was revolutionized when brain imaging came along. You could look at brain structure in people while they were still alive, and people began to see structural differences in the brains of people with schizophrenia versus everyone else. And this now raises a huge interpretive problem. So you got somebody who's 40 years old and you're imaging them and you see them with their schizophrenia. Something is different in the structure of their brain than you would expect. So now you got a critical question. Is that because of the schizophrenia? Or is that because they've spent the last 25 years taking drugs that futz with their dopamine systems and things like that? Is it due to the disease or is it due to the treatment of the disease? And it's known, obviously, that if you have high dose dopamine receptor blockers for years and years on end, if you start killing neurons in the Parkinson's part of the brain and get symptoms there, you know treatment itself is changing the brain. And thus, you get the thing which schizophrenia researchers dream of, they pray for, they stab each other to get access to these subjects first. Somebody who's having their first psychotic episode. Late teenager, early adult, adolescent, that's somebody who is having all the symptoms of schizophrenia, but they haven't been medicated yet. That's like identical twins separated at birth for behavior geneticists, schizophrenia, unmedicated schizophrenic individuals. And that's the best because you go do brain imaging there and you could find out something about the disease without the confound of years or decades of some of these really heavy duty neuroactive drugs. So once that's in place, you have one additional confound, which is people with schizophrenia, once they're trying to take care of themselves because they usually has been dumped by society somewhere and are typically homeless by now, we will get to that, usually have terrible nutrition. And as you get older, a lifetime of poor nutrition does a lot of degenerative things in the brain. And there's a type of dementia that's related to it. It's called Korsakoff's dementia, things of that sort. So now you're looking at an aging individual with schizophrenia and you're looking at brain structure. And is it due to the disease? Is it due to the meds for all those decades? Or is it due to the consequences of terrible nutrition all that time? More challenges in doing this. As people move on in their years with the disease, what you see is the positive symptoms tend to flatten out. They tend to become less present. You still hear the voices, but they don't feel compelling to you, or maybe they stop altogether. It gets dominated as the years go by the negative affect, the flatness, the withdrawal, all of that. The florid positive symptoms tend to blunt with the years in schizophrenia. Okay, so we've just figured out we got to control for the meds, we got to control for not squishing the brain, we got to control for nutrition, do the studies that control for all of that. And do you see any structural differences in the brains of people with schizophrenia? And the answer is yes. And this began to be appreciated in the 80s with the first brain imaging stuff, where people noticed something really interesting in the brains of people with schizophrenia, which is there's these things called ventricles. Ventricles, I've not mentioned that word in the course if you haven't heard of the dope. Ventricles are these little caverns inside your brain filled with cerebral spinal fluid. There's four of them. They have a very consistent sort of positioning of them. There's these little fluid-filled cavities inside the brain. And what's it for? That's where cerebral spinal fluid is being made. And it turns out that some neurons communicate with other ones by dumping messengers into the cerebral spinal fluid in the ventricles where they have an effect on the other side. That's a whole world of interesting stuff. But what people noticed was the brains of people with schizophrenia had enlarged ventricles. They were gigantic. And this was absolutely clear by late 80s, early 90s. And now people had to go look up what in hell do the ventricles do? What might be the consequences of an enlarged ventricle? And it took people a while to figure out this wasn't the interesting thing going on. The ventricles got bigger because the cortex was thinning out, and thus the ventricles expanded. And that's when people started worrying, am I seeing the cortex thinning out here because it thins out, or because I squished the brain and flattened the cortex, taking the brain out? That's where it became real relevant. Oh, ventricular enlargement as the first observation. Ventricular enlargement secondary to thinning of the cortex. All throughout the cortex, particularly in the more associative abstract regions, of course, including the frontal cortex. And what was that about? You were seeing neurons are shriveling up there. There's loss of some neurons. There's loss of glial cells. So there's atrophy of the cortex. In addition, there's atrophy of the hippocampus. And people paid a lot of attention to this, mostly because it was just so cool and interesting. Okay, so hippocampus has different cell fields. It's beautiful structure. You would fall in love with it. And there's a layer of neurons here in one part of the hippocampus, which send projections to a next layer, which sends it to the next and next, and all of that. And what people started seeing post-mortem studies of brains with people with schizophrenia was there was loss of some of these hippocampal neurons in a particular cell field. And weirdest of all, sometimes they were sending off their axons in totally loony directions. There was disturbed cytoarchitectural orientation to the processes. I don't know, if I had my hippocampal neurons going in the wrong direction, I would assume there's some consequences of that. So that may explain some of the cognitive issues of the disease. What's really most interesting to people, though, is the changes in the cortex, the atrophy of the cortex. So we look at our favorite part of the cortex, the PFC, and what's happening there. There's atrophy of neurons. There's loss of neurons. There's loss of neuronal processes. The patterns of circuitry become more simplified. And again, that's looking at individuals who are unmedicated. People with schizophrenia, this is not from the drugs. This is the disease itself. What you also see is within the frontal cortex, yes, remember this. Here we have those neurons that release GABA as inhibitory and would normally be blunting, signaling from this neuron to this neuron. And there's preferential loss of neurons that release GABA, meaning dopamine projections coming into the cortex are releasing more dopamine than would be usual. The other thing you see on the cellular level in the frontal cortex is you're losing some of the long distance projections. Aha, we've heard about this before. The emergence, all of that choppy, isolated frontal function. Okay, so this now brings us to where does early experience come into this? Because just knowing about dopamine or knowing about your hippocampus facing backwards is not going to tell me much about the disease. Where does early experience come into this? Big time. First off, how do you know that early experience is even relevant? Because you look at identical twins. Remember from the adoption studies, from the twin studies, if you have schizophrenia and you have an identical twin, they've got a 50% chance of having it also. 1 to 2% in the red general population. Whoa, like 20-fold higher incidence. 50% chance of getting a real big vote for genes. 50% chance of them not getting it and then having the same genes. But nonetheless, this high concordance between twins begins to tell you something about early environment. Early environment, the fact that you can have the same genes, but different likelihoods of getting schizophrenia. Interesting finding, when you have two twins who were discordant, identical twins, one has it, the other doesn't. The one with schizophrenia, on the average, tends to have a smaller brain. Okay, so twin studies are telling you, yeah, environment has something to do with it. What kind of environment? Starting in fetal life, huge amounts of fetal stress increase the incidence of schizophrenia. Where was this first identified? Back to behavior genetics, fetal environment, that Dutch hunger winter phenomenon. People who spent that winter when people in Holland were being starved by the Nazis, people who spent that winter being the third trimester fetus, we saw that causes epigenetic changes in their metabolism. All of that, isn't that cool? It also causes a significant increase in the risk of schizophrenia in that population. The same thing was observed in people who were fetuses in the late 1950s when there was a massive famine in China, and those individuals carried an increased risk of schizophrenia. So that's part of it. Other hints: birth complications, birth traumas, having to pull the kid out with calipers, brief hypoxia during birth complications increase the risk of schizophrenia. Or births in the winter, being born during the months of the year where traditionally humans would be having the toughest time surviving. It's the coldest. Something about a challenging ecosystem has something to do with it. More evidence that the prenatal environment is there. Back to our identical twins, either with one placenta, monochorionic, or two placentas. Monochorionic twins are more likely to share having schizophrenia than dichorionic ones. Fetal circulatory factors coming from mom, all of that. So what else? Early in life, getting into childhood, what about environment might predispose to schizophrenia, what might cause schizophrenia? And here we get to this appalling history in psychiatry built around the fact that up until around the 1980s, you get an adolescent who's showing their first signs of schizophrenia, and you take them to a well-trained psychiatrist, and they say, yes, yes, it's schizophrenia. And in your heartbreak, you say, what causes this disease? And up until the 80s or so, the most frequent answer you would get from the psychiatrist would be, you did. You caused it with your pathological mothering style, and was called schizophrenogenic mothering. And one of the readings is sort of a brief history of schizophrenogenic mothering and the unbelievably toxic lunacy in the thinking that went into it, and the number of lives of women that were just destroyed by being told, you caused your child schizophrenia, because unconsciously you hate them. Unconsciously, you wish they hadn't been born. And there's zero evidence for mothering style causing schizophrenia. That's another environmental risk factor for people with a genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia. Lots of cannabis exposure in adolescence. Here I sound like your parents and telling you that this is really, really solid, and maybe just to not get labeled with the hypocrite thing you might want to fling at your parents in temptation, I've never taken an illicit drug in my life. I've actually never had a sip of alcohol in my life. Okay, what else? What else about development? So now we're looking at the fact that there's this adolescent onset, late adolescent in most cases. What's occurring just before that? And there's typically a role for stress. Stress, when people retrospectively go back, there was a major stressor at some point during adolescence. This is a kid where, yeah, things were odd with them from the very beginning. They had odd patterns of socializing. They had imaginary playmates to a much older age than everyone else. They were kind of off-putting. They said weird stuff, all that, but they were kind of holding on. They were sort of doing okay. And then that year when they were 17, that's the year they had the car accident. That's the year their beloved dog died. That's the year they had their first heartbreak of a relationship breaking up with a person who was cruel to them afterward. And that's when they had been sort of holding on, declining a bit and functioning, and that's the point where it suddenly gets a lot steeper. A predisposing stressor is found in the literature over and over there. And thus, we got to think about all the stuff about what the developing brain is learning about the world with respect to stress. And in this case, especially the part of the brain that is still doing its most growing, the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex suddenly really relevant. And in lots of ways, one might begin to think of schizophrenia developmentally being a disease that emerges when you've got your last hurrah of getting the prefrontal cortex right and you don't. So, what is known about what's going on with that? You see something interesting, prefrontal cortical maturation. It doesn't fully mature till you're 25. And I think we've talked about this. What would you assume is happening? When you're 12, you don't have your adult number of neurons there, and adolescence consists of getting more neurons, and that's what the delayed development is about. That's not what the delayed development is about. At the time that you were hitting adolescence, on the average, you have more neurons in your prefrontal cortex than you will have as an adult. What's occurring during adolescence? You're trimming away neurons, trimming away synapses that are superfluous, that are more sloppy. You are making for a meaner, leaner prefrontal cortex in adulthood. It's about sculpting away superfluous neurons and synapses. And the best evidence is that in schizophrenia, during late adolescence, that pruning away is going on too much. There's excessive pruning of neurons and synapses in the prefrontal cortex. Okay, more weird stuff in terms of early environment, totally weird stuff, as if being born in winter, raising your chances of schizophrenia isn't weird enough. There's a whole bunch of different viruses. If you were exposed to some virus as a fetus, there's an increased chance of schizophrenia. Retroviruses, in particular, the ones that trigger jumping gene events, and we will see shortly why that may make some sense. There's a totally bizarre, wonderful parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, which, if it gets into you when you're a fetus, it causes a fairly significant increased risk of schizophrenia later in life. It's one of the stronger predictive factors, and it's taken people forever to accept that. This is a parasite, a protozoan parasite that gets into you, and it gets into your gut most typically, and it spends the next year slowly migrating to your brain, or the next season, whatever, and it decides to reside in there and causes residual inflammation and things of that sort, and an increased risk of schizophrenia. Where do people get Toxoplasma gondii from? And here is the killer. Here's the great piece of this story, the life cycle of Toxo. Toxo can only reproduce sexually in the gut of a cat. Lions, kitty cats, felines, all of them, it can only reproduce sexually in the gut of a cat. People are figuring this out. Why? But I can't remember why. And then your toxocysts get excreted by the cat. And if you spend a lot of time hanging out around cat feces or cats or some such thing, there's an increased likelihood that you're going to inhale it or get it on your fingers and get it in your mouth. What's toxo normally doing there? It gets eaten by rodents in the cat feces, and toxo gets into the brains of rodents and makes them less afraid of cats. I kid you not, my lab actually spent a decade looking at this, of how does toxo know how to unwire hardwired fixed action patterns of fear in rats, and we maybe sort of kind of figured it out. But in any case, it gets into the brain of the rat. The rat isn't afraid of cats anymore, and soon that rat is inside the cat's stomach where the reproductive cycle goes on again. So if instead of the cat to rat to cat to rat life cycle, circle of life, if instead it's getting into you because you touched or whatever, that's an increased chance of getting infected with toxoplasma. And if you have a fetus, the same thing. And thus, along with the literature on toxo-infections, increasing the risk, cats. There's a connection statistically between having a cat and an increased vulnerability to schizophrenia. Not a billion of a gigantic effect. It's a small finding in there, but it is consistent nonetheless. And if this explains mad cat ladies, who knows? But it does explain one piece of advice which is given to pregnant women, which is stay away from your cat litter box because the feces have toxo and you could get toxoplasmosis from it and potentially your fetus. Okay, so toxo has something to do with it. Chronic inflammation in the brain increases the risk. Growing up in an urban area increases the risk. Father's age, the older a father is, the greater risk of schizophrenia in the offspring. Sperm aging, epigenetic stuff, who knows what's going on there. And my favorite, having a parent who worked for a long time in the dry cleaning business increases the risk of schizophrenia. I don't know, some chemical related to that, who knows what, but all sorts of these markers early in life, all sorts of these risk factors, which collectively are pretty confusing. Nonetheless, within this overall picture, certain types of major stress during fetal life or perinatal around the time of birth increase the risk of schizophrenia thereafter, and major emotional stressors during adolescence as one of the more common triggers of a barely holding on kid to suddenly slide into florid psychosis. So this brings us to our next box. Further back, our next bucket. How about genetics? Genetics, do genes have anything to do with schizophrenia? Yes, obviously. Just as twin studies tell you the importance of environment. Wow, 50% of individuals with the same genes as their schizophrenic sibling, identical sibling, don't get schizophrenia. 50% of them do. The twin studies as striking evidence for a genetic component, and that is really solid amid all the complaints one might come up with about a heritability score back from oh so many classes ago. We also heard the same evidence for genetics in the first classic adoption study. Back to behavior genetics, that was that study carried out in Scandinavian populations. This Harvard psychiatrist, neuroscientist Seymour Ketty led this landmark study looking at thousands and thousands of adopted individuals, looking at their adoptive parents versus their biological parents and looking at patterns of schizophrenia and seeing if you have a biological parent who had schizophrenia and all you got from them were your genes, and then you were adopted right at birth, do you have an increased risk of schizophrenia? And we know two things from that. The first thing we know is we already know the result. Have neither a biological legacy of schizophrenia or an adoptive one, and 1 to 2%, the same rate as in the general population. No biological legacy of schizophrenia, but raised in a household with a parent, an adoptive parent who is schizophrenic, and 3%. Roughly a doubling, tripling of the chances of it. Now, the critical one that floored people, that suddenly made genetics a branch of psychiatry. Look at someone who was raised in a household, an adoptive one, with no legacy of schizophrenia, but a biological legacy and somewhere in the ballpark of a 9-fold increase in the risk of the disease. Wow, what you were getting biologically from your parent before you were then adopted way at birth carries a massive risk factor. And what we also saw was double whammy, biological legacy of schizophrenia, adoptive household legacy of schizophrenia, and like a 16% chance, a synergistic increase. So that's the first important thing, this classic finding, and this compared to this compared to this, arguing for there being a genetic component to schizophrenia because all you're getting from your biological parents there are your genes. Wait a second, you are hopefully saying right at this moment, leaping out of your seat, didn't we spend like half of a week on the fact that you can't conclude that because of prenatal environment and all of that stuff, and all of those confounds come in, but when those are controlled for to the extent that they can be, there still is a whoppingly strong genetic signal that's being carried along in schizophrenia. So, what do we know about the genes? All the usual stuff at this point. Ancient molecular biology, like from the 1980s, coming up not where you would identify a gene, you would get what would be called a genetic marker, a stretch of DNA that has something to do with the disease, and there's umpteen genes within that stretch, and one of them, something maybe. So people started doing those studies, and that got the first evidence for schizophrenia having a genetic component. And there was a big problem with that because whatever marker the first group found, which was front page news, scientists identify genetic vulnerability stretch, all of that, the next group couldn't replicate it. They got a different marker, and the third group got a different marker, and a total mess. Then the next stage, you bring molecular biology into it, which is looking at candidate genes. Looking for genes where you know they've got something to do with important stuff here, something relevant to dopamine, something relevant to any of those domains. And what you begin to see is hints of genetic abnormalities with that enzyme COMT that breaks down dopamine, evidence of abnormalities of mutations in what's called the D2 dopamine receptor, other bits of that coming through. Bits of evidence of mutations in the immune system. In particular, that major histocompatibility complex. Go back to the class on recognizing relatives and where your cells get an individual signature and where your pheromones do that. MHC genes have a higher than chance level of having mutations implicated with schizophrenia. What's that about? One possible piece of it is about 15 years ago, somebody in the department here, Carla Schatz, who's one of the greatest neuroscientists on earth, revolutionized thinking about how brain development works and showing that when you are trimming away excess synapses during brain maturation, say the frontal cortex, you're making use of the immune system to do that. So mutations in the immune system, maybe that had something to do with the abnormal synaptic pruning, all of that. And here's how desperate the field became. There was an additional gene that was implicated called DISC1. DISC1, disrupted in schizophrenia 1. They have so little idea of what the hell the gene does that they can't even give it a name that's anything other than, well, the gene that's screwy in schizophrenia. Okay, that's not a great acronym. How about disrupted in schizophrenia? DISC1. They have no idea what it even does. All they can say is it's disrupted. Nobody knows squat about it, what it does. Bits of insight coming, but at the beginning, here's just this interesting unknown gene that pops up with schizophrenia. So let's give it a schizophrenia flavored name while we have no idea what it's doing. More things that go on, more things genetically, macro genetic abnormalities in schizophrenia. It occasionally takes the form of deletions, not a point mutation, but a deletion of like a whole stretch of one chromosome's arm. And one of the more frequent ones that's been identified is a stretch that contains the gene for COMT, that enzyme that breaks down dopamine. So evidence for that. The more frequent evidence, though, is for gene duplication. More copies of genes than would normally be the case. Gene copies duplicated, and this has given rise to this whole subfield in sort of schizophrenia genetics of what's called looking for copy number variants. You're supposed to have 2 copies of this gene, and people with schizophrenia tend to have 3 to 4. You're supposed to have only 1 copy, and people with schizophrenia have 2, and you can by now have a sense of what some of the molecular evolutionary steps were going. So something on that macro level. Nobody can say much yet about why particular genes are duplicated at a higher than expected rate in schizophrenia, what the consequences are of that, but macro level abnormalities. Finally, of course, jumping in with sort of the gold standard, then you do the genome-wide surveys of the whole genome and looking for hotspots, and you know exactly what's going to be found, which is hundreds of genes implicated. The last time I could force myself to read one of those papers, it was more than 700 genes. And you know exactly what I'm going to say next, which is 700 genes, and collectively they explain a tiny percentage of the variance, telling you that either there are lots more genes involved, and you just need to get more sensitive genome-wide screening techniques, or like there's other stuff going on, like environment or any of these things we've been going on about here. A few interesting hints, though. The genes in these genome-wide surveys that have been implicated, most of them, their functions are unknown. Big surprise. Good luck now spending your career looking at one of them and figuring out what it does of those 700. Next interesting hint. In the brains of people with schizophrenia, they tend to be more methylated than average, had been subject to more epigenetic silencing. That's kind of interesting. And disproportionately, these are genes whose proteins are only expressed in the brain. So, whoa, 700, we have no idea what's going on, but there's a footprint there that these are genes that are really brainocentric, and these are genes that have been really subject to epigenetic regulation during development. Interesting, hence, that's where that field is at. Final bit about the genetics of schizophrenia. Okay, so you look at this, and we went through all these symptoms of schizophrenia, and that looks totally different from the symptoms of depression, which looks totally different from the symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, all of that. And all of these have genetic contributors to it. And people go and do the genetic research, and these genes have been implicated in schizophrenia, and these in depression, and these in that psychiatric disorder. What you see instead is there's a tremendous amount of overlap. Genes that have been implicated in a number of different psychiatric disorders. And not just, amid all of the schizophrenia-like disorders, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, schizoid, or not just unipolar depression, atypical depression, like gene overlaps between the psychoses and the affective disorders and the characterological disorders, all of that. This has been a huge challenge / disappointment to the field because of how much it has complicated everything. We know this by now. Different combinations, different orchestrations of genetic vulnerabilities, times environment, and in this type of environment that heads you in the direction of this disorder, this one, it heads you in that direction. And this makes perfect sense. Just to show you how awful this overlap business has gotten, disc 1, disrupted in schizophrenia. We don't know what it does, but at least we know it is like something specific to schizophrenia. Disc 1 mutations have now been implicated in depression and bipolar disorder and oppositional behavior and who knows what. It is not specifically disruptive in schizophrenia. So the whole field is hugely challenged and leading us to like a conclusion that we know inside out by now, which is there's genetic risk factors. There's genetic risk factors that overlap for different types of psychiatric disorders. There's hints of events starting in fetal life that are more likely to make the genetic vulnerability turn into an actual disease, or more likely to make the genetic vulnerability with this overlap turn into that disease instead of that one. And we know that throughout the large role of stress in triggering it, and some of the hot spots in the brain where things are functionally and structurally wrong in schizophrenia, once again, have stress written all over it. So that's kind of the state of that field at this point. So this moves us to our final box, the evolution of schizophrenia. How do you know it has evolved? That, yeah, there's a genetic component, the same deal. So we ought to ask the same question as with depression the other day. Do you see schizophrenia-like behavior in other species? Nah. You see depressive behavior all over the place in other primates in very familiar settings, but you don't see anything that looks like the symptoms of schizophrenia in another animal. And like, go look at like what everyday life is like for another primate up there. And if you were thought disordered and hallucinating and all that stuff, you are not going to last long on the savannah. The best evidence is it's only us genetically. And none of the genetic markers implicated in schizophrenia have been shown in other primates. So we're alone with that one. So, what are the downsides of schizophrenia? Like in terms of making sense of decreasing your Darwinian fitness, it's clear people with schizophrenia have lower reproductive success. They've got shorter lifespans. They've got that sort of thing. It is maladaptive. You leave fewer copies of your genes than average. You have a shorter life expectancy. People with schizophrenia very rarely get old. They have most likely been dumped out of some psychiatric hospital, which is what happened after the neuroleptics were invented in the 50s. 90% of the hospital beds in psychiatric hospitals in the country emptied out over the next 2 years. Wow, what great revolution. And the plan was these people would be deinstitutionalized and we would set up all these community mental health clinics, and none of them got funded, and way too many of those people wound up homeless on the streets. See somebody on the street talking to themselves, and almost certainly they are a deinstitutionalized individual with schizophrenia. And they don't live for long. Okay, so there's all these downsides. Are there any plus sides to schizophrenia? Okay, enough of that crap we had at the very beginning about hidden blessings, all of that. Are there any pluses? There's this weird thing in the literature. People with schizophrenia get cancer at a much lower than expected rate. Who knows what that's about? But all along, there's an additional evolutionary advantage to schizophrenia. And it is so cool and so interesting that I'm not going to tell you about it until Monday.